I was 87 years old when I finally agreed to speak. For decades, people had asked me. Neighbors, my grandchildren, even a minister who visited every Sunday for 11 years. They all wanted to know the same thing, and I gave them the same silence. But on a gray Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1931, I sat down in a wooden chair by a frost-covered window. I folded my hands in my lap, steadied my breath, and began to talk. I spoke for hours. I spoke without tears, without apology, without the softening that old age so often brings. And when I was finished, no one in that room said a word, because what I described was not simply a grievance. It was not some family quarrel worn thin by time. It was something older, heavier, far more permanent than any of that. My mother made a decision when I was 14 years old, a decision that could not be undone, a decision that shaped every single day of the 73 years that followed, and I never forgave her. Not once, not even at the very end. This is my story, exactly as I lived it, the world she was born into, a daughter of the Ohio Valley, and the woman who would shape her fate. Her name was Eleanor Ruth Calloway, though she had not always carried that name with any sense of belonging. She was born Eleanor Ruth Harding on the 4th of March, 1844, in a small farming settlement in Licking County, Ohio, roughly 30 miles east of Columbus. The land there was green in summer and brutal in winter, the kind of terrain that rewarded patience and punished weakness. She would come to understand both of those lessons better than most. Eleanor was the second of 7 children born to William and Naomi Harding. Her father was a quiet, deliberate man who had come to Ohio from Western Virginia with his own father in 1831, carrying little more than a knowledge of soil and a willingness to work. He had purchased 8 acres of partially cleared land with borrowed money and a handshake agreement, and he had spent the better part of 15 years turning it into something that could sustain a family. By the time Eleanor was old enough to understand what the farm represented, it was not merely land. It was the accumulated labor of 2 generations, the physical proof that her family had endured, had persisted, had built something where there had been nothing. Her mother, Naomi Harding N.A. Alcott, was a different kind of person entirely. She had been raised in the town of Newark, Ohio, the eldest daughter of a dry goods merchant who had done reasonably well for himself and was not shy about mentioning it. Naomi had received more education than most women of her era and class, attending a small female academy in Newark for 3 years, where she had studied reading, composition, basic arithmetic, and the domestic arts considered appropriate for a young woman of modest refinement. She had married William Harding at the age of 19, drawn to his steadiness and what she then believed was a shared vision of quiet prosperity. The shared vision, it turned out, was not quite as shared as she had imagined. Naomi had expected that steady work on good land would eventually translate into comfort, into a proper house with plastered walls, into social standing within the county, into the kind of life her father had managed to build through trade. William had expected that his wife understood farming as it actually was, with all its uncertainties and reversals, its dependence on weather and markets, and 100 variables no man could control. Neither had fully communicated these expectations before the wedding. Neither fully understood the other until it was far too late, Eleanor grew up inside this misalignment. She felt it the way a child feels temperature, not always consciously, but constantly. The house held a particular kind of tension, one that never quite broke into open conflict, but never resolved itself either. Her mother moved through the rooms with a kind of controlled dissatisfaction, always efficient, always capable, but carrying in her expression a permanent suggestion that this was not quite what she had intended for herself. Her father moved more slowly, more carefully, watching his wife with a mixture of guilt and helplessness, aware that he was failing some expectation he had never quite been able to name. The children, all 7 of them, arranged themselves around this tension instinctively. The older ones grew quieter, the younger ones grew louder, filling the silences with noise that didn't require interpretation. Eleanor, positioned in the middle, grew watchful. She noticed things. She catalogued them. She filed them away in a part of her mind that she did not yet have words to describe. She noticed, for instance, that her mother never complained about the farm directly. She never said plainly that she was unhappy with the life she had. Instead, she spoke in comparisons. She spoke of how her father's house had been furnished. She spoke of families in Newark who had managed to acquire better circumstances through better decisions. She spoke of women she had known at the academy who had married men with more ambition, men who had gone into business or law or commerce, men who had not spent their lives arguing with the weather. Eleanor also noticed that her father never responded to these comparisons directly. He simply continued doing what he had always done. He woke before dawn. He worked until dark. He came inside, ate whatever was prepared, and sat in silence for an hour before sleeping. If the comparison stung him, he gave no sign. If they produced in him the same cold weight they produced in Eleanor when she overheard them, he kept it entirely to himself. Eleanor began to understand something that most children her age had not yet begun to grasp. She began to understand that love, even when it was real, was not sufficient armor against the particular damage that 2 people could do to each other simply by being fundamentally mismatched in what they needed from the world. She loved both her parents. She was quite certain of this, but she loved them the way one loves people who are in pain, carefully, from a slight distance, with a constant awareness that the wrong word or gesture might break something already fragile. Her formal education was typical of the time and place. A one-room schoolhouse operated from late autumn through early spring, when the farming calendar allowed for children to be spared from labor. The teacher was a young man named Mr. Aldous Fenwick, who had attended Ohio Wesleyan University for 2 years before finances forced him to withdraw. He was earnest, occasionally inspired, and deeply committed to the idea that education mattered even in places where most adults considered it secondary to the demands of agricultural life. Eleanor was his best student, and they both knew it. She absorbed everything he taught and demanded more. She read every book in the schoolhouse twice. She borrowed from Mr. Fenwick's own small collection of volumes, returning them within days. She asked questions that went beyond what the curriculum provided, questions about history, about the larger world, about how things had come to be the way they were. Mr. Fenwick encouraged her. He told her, carefully, privately, that a mind like hers deserved more than a one-room schoolhouse in Licking County. He told her there were academies that accepted young women, that learning was not wasted on girls regardless of what some people believed, that she should hold on to her curiosity and protect it. Her mother told her something different. Her mother told her that a woman's life was determined by the man she married, that intelligence was acceptable in a wife only to the extent that it made her a better manager of household affairs, that ambition in a woman was not a virtue but a liability because it produced disappointment, and disappointment produced bitterness, and bitterness was the ugliest quality a woman could possess. Eleanor listened to both of them. She believed Mr. Fenwick, but she lived in her mother's house, and the gap between those two facts would come to define everything that followed. The year everything changed, the death, the debt, and the silence before the storm. Eleanor was 11 years old in the spring of 1855, when the first serious crack appeared in the foundation of her family's life. It did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way most catastrophes arrive in farming families, quietly, dressed in the ordinary language of weather and bad luck. The spring planting had gone poorly. A late frost in April had killed most of the early crops. A wet May had prevented adequate replanting. By July, it was clear that the harvest would be severely reduced, perhaps the worst her father had seen since he had taken over the farm from his own father's failing hands. The debt that hung over the property, manageable in good years, suddenly became something else entirely and a bad one. Eleanor watched her father's face during that summer. She watched it change in ways she could not fully articulate, but understood instinctively. Something in him became more careful, more compressed, as if he were conserving some internal resource that was running dangerously low. He spoke less. He moved more deliberately. He sat at the kitchen table on evenings when he had previously gone to bed, spreading out papers that Eleanor was not supposed to see, running a finger down columns of numbers with the expression of a man reading a document that keeps delivering bad news. Her mother watched, too. Eleanor noticed that as well. Naomi Harding watched her husband's evenings at that table with an expression that Eleanor would spend decades trying to fully interpret. It was not quite fear. It was not quite contempt. It was something more complicated, a kind of vindication mixed with dread, as if some part of her had always known this was coming and was not entirely surprised to find herself proved right, but also understood that being right about a disaster was its own particular kind of loss. They did not discuss the financial situation with the children directly. This was typical of the era and the family. Difficulty was something to be managed, not aired. You did not burden your children with the knowledge of what might happen. You protected them from that particular weight for as long as the protection could be sustained. But Eleanor was not a child who was easily protected from anything. She was determined to understand. She listened at doorways. She read the expressions on faces. She heard fragments of conversations that were quickly silenced when she entered a room. And gradually, over the course of that difficult summer and the equally difficult autumn that followed, she assembled a picture that no one had intended her to see. The farm was in serious trouble. There was debt. The creditor was a man named Josiah Albright, who held the note on the property and was not, by any account Eleanor could piece together, a patient or charitable man. There had been extensions granted before. There would not be another one without something offered in return, something more substantial than promises. And then in the November of 1855, her father fell ill. It began as what seemed to be a chest cold, the kind of thing that came every winter and resolved itself in a week or two with rest and warmth. But this one did not resolve. It deepened. It settled into his lungs with a tenacity that alarmed the physician who rode out from Newark to examine him. The physician spoke to Naomi in quiet, careful language, the kind of language people used when they wanted to deliver information without delivering its full weight all at once. Eleanor heard enough to understand. She understood that her father was seriously ill. She understood that serious illness in a farming man with 7 children and an unpaid debt was not simply a personal tragedy. It was a logistical crisis that touched everything, every aspect of the family's survival. A farm without the labor of its primary worker was not simply a farm in difficulty. It was a farm in the process of ceasing to be a farm. Her father fought the illness for 6 months. He was not a man who surrendered easily to anything, and he did not surrender to this without resistance. There were weeks in which he seemed to be improving, weeks when color returned to his face and he could sit upright and speak at length, weeks when Eleanor allowed herself to believe that the worst was past. The worst was not past. William Harding died on the 17th of May, 1856. He was 41 years old. Eleanor was 12. The youngest child, her brother Samuel, was not yet 2. She would remember the day with a completeness that surprised her even decades later. She would remember the quality of the light coming through the thin curtains of her parents' bedroom in long pale stripes. She would remember the silence that fell over the house in the moments after, a silence different from any she had previously encountered, heavier and more permanent. She would remember her mother standing in the doorway of that room with her hands at her sides, not weeping, simply standing, as if she were taking a measurement of something. What Naomi was measuring. Eleanor would only understand years later. She was measuring what she had left. She was calculating what could be salvaged. The grief was real. Eleanor would not deny that. Whatever complicated feelings her mother carried about her marriage, she had loved William Harding in the way people love those who have been central to their lives for nearly 2 decades. The loss was genuine. The tears came eventually, late at night when the children were in bed, tears that Eleanor heard through the thin walls of the farmhouse and that she found, in their quietness, more frightening than any loud weeping would have been. But grief in a woman with 7 children and a failing farm and an unpaid debt to an impatient creditor had to compete with survival. And in Naomi Harding's particular architecture of character, survival had always been the stronger instinct. The neighbors helped as neighbors did. They brought food. They helped with the spring planting. They offered condolences and quiet assistance in the ways that rural communities had always managed the sudden losses that farming life regularly produced. This support was genuine and Eleanor was grateful for it, but it was temporary. The neighbors had their own farms, their own families, their own difficulties. The assistance lasted through the summer, and then it faded, and Eleanor's family was left with the reality of what they now were. A widow with 7 children, the oldest of whom was 13, the youngest not yet walking steadily, and a farm whose debt had not paused in its accumulation simply because the man responsible for paying it had died. By the autumn of 1856, it was clear that something would have to change. Eleanor felt it coming. She could not have named what form the change would take, but she felt its approach the way she had learned to feel changes in weather, as a pressure in the atmosphere, a quality in her mother's silences that was different from what it had been before. She was not wrong. The change was coming, and it was aimed directly at her. The transaction, what her mother did, and how she explained it. His name was Cyrus Calloway. Eleanor first encountered that name in the winter of 1856 when she overheard her mother speaking to Mrs. Peake, a neighbor who visited regularly, a woman of relentless opinions and detailed knowledge of everyone in the county's private affairs. The conversation stopped the moment Eleanor entered the room, but she had heard enough. She had heard Cyrus Calloway's name. She had heard her own name spoken in the same sentence, and she had heard her mother's voice carry an undertone that was different from its usual pitch, something that sounded faintly like relief. Eleanor filed this away. She asked no questions. She had already learned that asking questions produced either silence or careful redirection. She was better served by patience and attention than by direct inquiry. She learned the rest in pieces. Cyrus Calloway was 43 years old. He was a widower whose first wife had died in 1854, leaving him with a farm of some 200 acres outside the town of Granville in Licking County, a working farm with livestock and timber, and a modest income that, by the standards of the region, represented genuine stability. He had 3 children from his first marriage, the youngest of whom was 8, the oldest 14. He had managed the farm and the children with hired help for 2 years. But hired help was expensive and unreliable, and he required something more permanent. He had made inquiries through the church network that connected families in the county. He had made known that he was looking for a wife, preferably a young woman of good health and industrious character, someone capable of managing a household and its children, someone who could provide him with additional heirs if circumstances were favorable. He was not, by all accounts, seeking a romantic partnership. He was seeking a practical arrangement. He was a man who understood the farm economy well enough to know that what he needed was closer to management than to companionship. Eleanor's mother had been introduced to this situation through the minister of their congregation, a Reverend Horace Blaine, who served as a kind of clearinghouse for the social and practical needs of his parishioners. Reverend Blaine had mentioned Cyrus Calloway to Naomi with a delicacy that nonetheless communicated the essential facts. There was a man. He had resources. He was looking for a wife. Naomi had a daughter of marriageable age. The situation might be of mutual benefit. Naomi had listened. She had asked questions. She had met with Cyrus Calloway once in the Reverend's presence before any decision was reached. She had assessed him with the careful eye of a woman who had spent 20 years watching a farm either grow or refuse to grow, and she had concluded that he was solid, that he was reliable, that he represented a solution to a problem that was growing more pressing with every passing month. The problem, of course, was the debt. Josiah Albright had written twice since William Harding's death. His letters were polite in language and unambiguous in intent. The note on the property was due. Extensions had been granted. Good faith had been demonstrated on his part, and he expected it to be reciprocated. He did not wish to take any action that would be distressing to a widow with young children, but he was a businessman and not a charity, and the situation could not continue indefinitely. Naomi had no money. She had no prospect of acquiring money in the short term. She had a farm that produced enough to feed the family, but not enough to retire a debt, and she had 7 children, 6 of whom were years away from being able to contribute meaningfully to the farm's operation. She had one asset that could be converted quickly. Eleanor understood this. She understood it with a cold clarity that she had not been prepared for when the full explanation finally came. Her mother did not approach the subject obliquely. Whatever her faults, Naomi Harding was not a woman who hid behind euphemism when directness was more efficient. She sat Eleanor down one evening in January of 1857, when the younger children were asleep, and she explained the situation in plain language. She said that the farm was in danger of being lost. She said that Josiah Albright would foreclose if the debt was not addressed. She said that she had found a solution, a man of good standing and adequate means who was willing to take Eleanor as his wife in exchange for settling the outstanding debt and providing a modest sum besides, sufficient to carry the family through the next year while they found their footing. She said she believed this was the best possible outcome for everyone. She said she had thought about it carefully, and she was certain it was right. She said that Eleanor would be well provided for, that Cyrus Calloway was a respectable man, that many women married at 14 and managed perfectly well, that it was not so different from what Eleanor would have done eventually in any case, that this simply moved the timeline forward by a few years. She said that she hoped Eleanor would understand. Eleanor was 13 years old in 3 months. She would turn 14 in March. The wedding was planned for April. She sat and listened to her mother explain all of this in the same tone she used when explaining that winter required the mending of heavier coats or that butter needed to be churned before the temperature rose. Practical, organized, certain of the rightness of the plan. And Eleanor felt something happen inside her in that moment that she would later describe in her own account as a kind of internal severing. Not a breaking, exactly, something more deliberate than breaking, more like a door closing firmly, with the particular click of a latch engaging, the sound of something being locked from one side. She asked her mother one question. She asked whether she had any choice. Her mother paused for only a moment before answering. She said that of course Eleanor had a choice. Everyone had a choice. But she also said that the alternative was the loss of the farm, which would mean the family had nowhere to live, which would mean the younger children would suffer consequences that Eleanor, as the eldest daughter, surely did not wish to cause. Eleanor understood what that meant. It meant that the choice had already been made. The consultation was a formality, a gesture toward the appearance of consent. Her mother had made the decision and was now presenting it in language that allowed her to believe she had treated her daughter fairly. Eleanor nodded. She said nothing more. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of her siblings breathing around her. She thought about Mr. Fenwick, who had told her mind deserved more than a one-room schoolhouse. She thought about the books she had read, the worlds they had shown her, the possibilities they had suggested. She thought about what she had imagined her life might be, and then she put all of that somewhere small and interior, and she pressed it down as far as it would go. The wedding took place on the 12th of April, 1858. Eleanor Ruth Harding became Eleanor Ruth Calloway. She was 14 years old. Her husband was 44. The guests included the minister, several neighbors, and her mother, who wore her best dress and wept at the ceremony, and whom Eleanor watched from across the room with an expression that revealed nothing at all. 19 years, the life she lived inside the arrangement. The farm outside Granville was larger than the one she had grown up on. That was the first thing Eleanor registered when Cyrus Calloway drove her there in his wagon on the afternoon of their wedding day, the sky pale and cold above the greening Ohio fields. The house was also larger, though it had the particular character of a house that had been managed without a woman's attention for several years. Not neglected exactly, but stripped of the details that make a space inhabitable rather than merely functional. She cataloged it the way she had learned to catalog everything. The number of rooms, the condition of the floors, the state of the kitchen, which required significant work, the arrangement of the 3 children who stood in the doorway when she arrived, watching her with expressions that ranged from guarded curiosity to open hostility. Their names were Franklin, who was 15, Harriet, who was 12, and little George, who was 9, and who stared at her with large, dark eyes that contained more emotion than the other 2 were willing to display. Cyrus Calloway was not cruel. Eleanor would say this clearly in her account, and she would not be persuaded to revise it. He was not a violent man. He did not drink to excess. He worked hard, and he expected hard work from others, and he was not sadistic in his management of his household. Within the particular framework of what he was not the worst of what he could have been, but he was cold, profoundly, structurally cold, in the way that some people are cold not from meanness, but from a fundamental absence of the internal capacity for warmth. He had not chosen Eleanor because he wanted a companion. He had purchased a solution to a household management problem, and he related to her accordingly. He spoke to her about the farm, about the children's schedules, about what needed to be done and when. He did not speak to her about anything else. He did not ask about her interior life, because it had not occurred to him that she possessed one. She was a capable body attached to a quiet presence, and as long as the household ran smoothly, he required nothing more from her. The physical reality of the marriage Eleanor would not describe in detail in her account. She said only that she had not been consulted about it, that she had not been prepared for it, and that she had endured it with the same internal compression she brought to every other aspect of her situation. She had learned by then that endurance was not the same as defeat. She had learned that a person could survive a great deal without surrendering the central part of themselves, as long as they were careful about where they placed that central part, as long as they kept it somewhere private and protected. She found places to keep herself alive inside the arrangement. She read everything she could acquire. Cyrus had a small collection of books, mostly practical in nature, almanacs and agricultural manuals, but there was also a Bible with extensive concordances, and unexpectedly, a volume of Shakespeare's collected works that had belonged to his first wife. Eleanor read the Shakespeare with a hunger that surprised her. She read it at night after the household was settled by whatever light was available, moving through the plays and poems with the feeling of someone breathing freely after a long time in a confined space. She also formed a genuine connection with the youngest child, George. George was 9 when she arrived, and he attached himself to her with the straightforward need of a child who had lost his mother and who recognized, without being able to articulate it, that here was someone who saw him clearly. Eleanor responded to this attachment, not strategically but instinctively. She had warmth in her, and it had to go somewhere, and it went to George, who received it and flourished under it and grew into a young man who remained devoted to Eleanor long after he had his own family. Franklin, the eldest stepson, was another matter. He was 15, and he resented her arrival with the focused intensity of an adolescent who had managed, in his mother's absence, to occupy a particular position in the household hierarchy, and who understood that Eleanor's presence displaced him from it. He was not overtly hostile, but he was cold in a way that reminded Eleanor, with discomforting frequency, of his father. She worked around him carefully, neither confronting nor accommodating, maintaining a neutral consistency that eventually, years later, evolved into something closer to grudging respect. Harriet fell somewhere between her brothers. She was watchful, like Eleanor, and they recognized this in each other without ever discussing it. They developed a working relationship that was never warm, but was functional and occasionally almost companionable, built on a shared understanding that they were both navigating the same difficult terrain, and that cooperation served them better than conflict. Eleanor bore 4 children with Cyrus Calloway over the course of their marriage. A daughter, Ruth, was born in 1859. A son, William, named for her father, was born in 1861. A second daughter, Catherine, was born in 1864. A third pregnancy ended in loss in 1866. There were no more children after that. She did not know and did not ask whether this was a result of circumstance or something else. She simply noted the fact and moved forward. The children were the other place where she kept herself alive. She was ferocious about their education in a way that mystified Cyrus, who saw no particular value in educating children beyond what was necessary for farming and domestic management. Eleanor pressed the matter with a quiet persistence that he eventually found easier to accommodate than to resist. The children attended school. The children read books. The children were told privately by their mother that their minds were their own and that no circumstance could take that from them. She was speaking, of course, from experience. The years passed in the way that difficult years pass, slowly when you are inside them and with disorienting speed when you look back. The Civil War came and took Franklin away to fight for the Union, and returned him 2 years later, thinner and quieter, with something gone from his eyes that never quite came back. George went also near the end of the war, and returned intact in body, though changed in ways he did not speak about directly. Cyrus aged. His coldness did not soften with age, but it became less active, less demanding. He withdrew from the daily management of the farm gradually, yielding it in practice to Eleanor, who had been managing it in substance for years by then, though he retained the legal fiction of authority until the end. He died in the autumn of 1877. He was 64 years old. Eleanor was 33. She had been his wife for 19 years. She organized the funeral. She received the condolences. She thanked the minister. She accepted the casseroles and the sympathetic hands on her arm from neighbors who assumed she was grieving. She was not grieving. She was calculating. For the first time in 19 years, she was calculating not what she had to endure, but what she could build, what came after, and what never changed freedom reckoning, and the unforgiveness she carried to her grave. She was 33 years old, and she owned a 200-acre farm. This was not a simple fact. In 1877, a widow owning property of that scale was not common, and it was not always comfortable. There were men who assumed she would need guidance, men who appeared at her door with suggestions about how the farm might be better managed by them on her behalf, with whatever arrangement seemed equitable to their own interests. There were relatives of Cyrus who felt that the property should have been distributed differently, who muttered about their grievances in ways they expected to reach her and did. Eleanor dealt with all of it in the same manner she had dealt with everything since the age of 14. She listened carefully. She revealed nothing. She made decisions based on her own clear assessment of the situation, and she moved forward. She was a better farmer than Cyrus had been. This was not a boast. It was a practical observation that the farm's output over the 5 years following his death confirmed. She understood the land because she had been working it for 19 years. She understood the markets because she had been managing the household accounts, formally and informally, for nearly as long. She understood labor because she had been providing it, directing it, and calculating it from the day she arrived at the farm as a 14-year-old bride who had not been consulted about her own future. She hired the workers she needed and paid them fairly, which earned her a reputation for straight dealing that proved more valuable than any of the social posturing she had observed other landowners engage in. She reinvested in the property systematically. She made the farm productive not through brilliance or innovation, but through the steady, unrelenting competence she had been building for 2 decades. Her children grew. Ruth married a school teacher from Newark, which Eleanor found quietly satisfying given her history with school teachers. William took over the day-to-day management of the farm as he reached adulthood, working alongside his mother with a respect that was genuine and that Eleanor returned in kind. Catherine became a teacher herself, the first in the family to do so, and Eleanor attended her certification with an expression that those who knew her recognized as the closest she came to visible pride. She did not remarry. People expected her to, and she did not. She was occasionally asked by men who considered the farm an attractive inducement, regardless of what came attached to it, and she declined each approach with a courtesy that communicated its own finality. She had managed 19 years inside an arrangement not of her choosing. She had no intention of entering another one. She was not against the institution of marriage in principle. She told her daughters and granddaughters that marriage could be a genuine partnership between people who chose each other freely and honestly. She said the word chose with a particular emphasis that was not accidental. She said that what distinguished a partnership from an arrangement was whether both parties had entered it with their full consent and their eyes fully open. She said this without elaborating on her own history, but the daughters understood what she was saying and they remembered it. Her mother continued to live. This was the strange and particular difficulty of Eleanor's freedom. Naomi Harding outlived William by decades. She continued to manage the original farm with help from Eleanor's brothers as they reached adulthood, and she continued to live in the way she had always lived, with a kind of determined competence that made no acknowledgement of the past. Eleanor visited, because not visiting would have required explanations she did not wish to provide. She sat at her mother's table and drank tea and spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the children, the state of the roads. She watched her mother move through her kitchen with the same efficient certainty she had always possessed, and she felt something that she described in her account as the strangest kind of grief. Not grief for her mother, but grief for the relationship that had never existed and never would. Her mother never brought it up. Not once. Not in 30 years of occasional visits, of Christmas gatherings, of shared meals and shared grandchildren, and all the accumulating ordinary texture of family life. She never said anything that acknowledged what she had done when Eleanor was 13, sitting in the kitchen, hearing her own future described in the language of practical necessity. Eleanor waited. She understood at some level that she was waiting. She waited for some sign of recognition, some moment when her mother's eyes would hold something beyond the usual satisfaction of a capable woman reviewing the results of her household management. She waited for her mother to look at her, really look at her, and understand what those 19 years had been. She waited for an apology that she suspected and eventually accepted was never going to come. It was not going to come because her mother did not believe one was owed. This was the central fact. Eleanor turned it over many times in the decades after she understood it, examining it from different angles, testing it against her memory of her mother's expressions and words across a lifetime of interactions. And she always arrived at the same conclusion. Naomi Harding believed she had done right. She believed the arrangement had been necessary and that necessity made it righteous. She believed that Eleanor had been provided for, that she had a farm and children and a respectable position in the county, and that these outcomes vindicated the decision. She had never, in any meaningful sense, seen Eleanor as someone who had been harmed. She had seen Eleanor as a problem that had been solved. This understanding settled into Eleanor over the years with the permanence of geological fact. It did not enrage her the way it once had. Rage had been her early response, sharp and consuming, the rage of someone who has been wronged and cannot yet accept that justice is unavailable. But rage requires energy that life eventually reclaims. By the time Eleanor was 50, the rage had transformed into something colder and more durable. Not bitterness exactly. Something more like a final verdict, clearly worded and carefully considered, from which she did not intend to appeal. She never forgave her mother. She was clear about what this meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean she spent her days consumed by resentment. She did not. She spent her days managing her farm, raising her children, reading her books, building the life that had been delayed by 19 years but had not, ultimately, been destroyed. She was not a bitter woman in the way the word bitterness is typically understood, as someone corroded by grievance, unable to move forward. She had moved forward. She had moved forward with a completeness that sometimes surprised her, but she had not forgiven, and she would not, because forgiveness, as Eleanor understood it, was not simply a decision to feel differently about the past. It was not a private mental adjustment made for one's own peace. Forgiveness was a moral transaction. It required two parties. It required the person who had done harm to acknowledge the harm, to understand it, to express some genuine recognition of what had been taken. Without that acknowledgement, what was being offered under the name of forgiveness was not actually forgiveness at all. It was simply a renaming of surrender. Her mother had never acknowledged anything. She had gone to her grave in the spring of 1913 at the age of 91 without ever once saying to Eleanor, "I understand what I cost you. I understand what those 19 years were. I am sorry." She had gone to her grave. Eleanor was certain, believing she had been a good mother. And Eleanor had gone through the remainder of her own long life and would go to her grave, believing otherwise.